Hello and welcome to a new episode on the Wars Rebellion podcast. I'm your host, Niels Eichhorn, and as usually for these types of events, I am joined today by my French partner, who I will see in a couple of weeks in Prague for the first time in person, Andrew Hauk. And we decided to continue our sort of 20th anniversary book series, even though we're slightly off with the one today, a little bit, but we're close. And we're going to the wonderful silver state of Nevada and the gambling paradise of Las Vegas today with our guest, which is, of course, the illustrious, incredible, and impossible Michael Scott Green at UN Las Vegas, who, condolences, commiserations, is also the department head of the Department of History there. Uh, Michael has published extensively, to say the least. We have, for example, Lincoln and the Election of 1860 with Southern Illinois University Press in 2011. And he also did a book that we two did an interview about when it was still in the written form on Age Civil War, Lincoln and Native Americans, which also came out with Southern Illinois University Press. He has published extensively on Las Vegas and Nevada, but today we're going to talk about his book, Freedom, Union, and Power, Lincoln and His Party During the Civil War, which, if Fordham University Press's website is correct, came out in April of 2004. Ooh, 20 years on, your kid has moved on to college, Michael, and is sitting through its sophomore year U.S. history course.
Well, either
Yeah,
that or since it was April 2004, it's old enough to drink.
I was gonna say
That
it's
too.
a drinking age.
Might
Probably needs
benefit from a
both.
couple of drinks, come to think of it. It would be a
So,
better book.
yeah. Hey, we have a book that kid drink. Haven't had that in a while.
That's different.
So, let's start with the origins. How did you come to write a book about the ideology of the Republican Party in 2004, which was about 28 years after Eric Foner's Give Me um, Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Man book, if I think that was about
Yeah,
right.
somewhere in there. And he had an influence on it, partly because he was my graduate advisor. A very good reason
Hmm.
for him to have influence. And I enjoy telling this story, especially to graduate students figuring out a dissertation topic. Because when I went to Columbia to enter the PhD program in the fall of 1988, I brought with me a little piece of paper where I had written down a bunch of topics. And I still have that paper somewhere. And when I arrived, I said to Foner, should we discuss a dissertation topic? And not for the last time, in my case, he snickered a little. And then he said, you're going to change your mind 5 times in the next 3 weeks. And I did. And eventually I came to him with this list and started going down it. And in each case, he would shoot it down, not in an unkind way, but he'd say, well, I hear someone is doing this, or I hear this person's writing on that one, whatever. So it turned out I had a lot of book ideas other people were already doing, as it turned out. And I was trying to figure out what would work best for me, someone who's interested in political culture, political life. And I had even asked Eric Foner how he came up with free soil, free labor, free men. And he said that he had gone to his advisor, Richard Hofstadter, fairly distinguished lineage, and he had said, I want to write a book about the Civil War that does what you did with the American political tradition. And Hofstadter said, fine, go ahead. And I said, that was it? He said, yes, I didn't have to do a prospectus. You are not so fortunate. Well, as it turned out, if you remember in Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Men, there's a chapter on salmon chase. And he said that that chapter was kind of left over from the original idea. So I was blundering about, thinking about it, and then this sticks with me for whatever reason. I was walking up Broadway from 112th, where my apartment was, to the Columbia campus, which started on 114th, the History Building, Fairweather Halls at 116th in Amsterdam. And I tripped, which is not unusual for me. And as I caught myself and was sort of flopping around, I said to myself, the ideology of the Republican Party during the Civil War. And I ran to his office. And I said, you know, you've done Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Men. You've told us how the Republican Party got to the Civil War. And you've done Reconstruction, so we know what came out afterward. But what did they do in between?
Hmm.
I think that would be kind of interesting. And anyone who knows Eric Foner knows that he is even more brilliant than you think. And he sat there for a second. He said, I don't know. And then he proceeded to say, well, you can do a chapter on this, and you have a chapter on that. And he proceeded to recite basically the chapters that made up the book. So I proceeded from there. The origin story of the book takes a while because my career took some strange turns. I grew up in Las Vegas, went to the University of Nevada, Las Vegas for my bachelor's and master's, and came back to live with my parents when the funding ran out. And I was an only child, and that was not a problem to them. And I was starting to write and teach as well about local history and was hired at our community college to teach mainly Nevada history, though I taught other things. And I was teaching 5 to 6 courses a semester. And this reduced attention to the dissertation. So did my interest in other activities around Las Vegas and getting involved in things. And in a way, that's a problem for someone who is trying to write their dissertation where they grew up.
Hmm.
So you're
It's not
talking,
that
of
I,
course, about gambling and
well, and I've led an uninteresting life, so I didn't gamble, but I certainly did spend time with parents and with friends and get involved in community things. And I eventually got a letter from Columbia saying, you know, you're running low on time. So I asked for the 1 year extension and got moving. Met the woman I have married, and Deborah said one day, you know, if you'd finished that dissertation, we could go away on weekends and the like. And I always say that was the motivator. Nothing like love to get you moving. And in the interim, Eric had encountered Paul Cimbala, who was a professor at Fordham, who was editing a series called The North Civil War. And I think a lot of graduate students at the time, and certainly a lot of Eric's graduate students, were doing more on Reconstruction. Logical, since the Reconstruction book had come out in '88, the year I arrived at Columbia. No connection. And Paul said, do you have anybody doing anything on the North? And Eric said something like, I have a guy who's doing the Republican Party, and if he knew that you were going to publish the book, he might get moving. And that didn't hurt either. So I knew pretty well that Fordham was interested, and finally in 2000 finished, defended, and I have to tell this story. We flew into New York City to defend the night of May 5th, 2000. And early the next morning, we arrive at JFK, and I am running along with Deb and my best friend from grad school, Yannick Michkowski, who writes about 20th century presidents. And there was an unlit, unmarked construction area. I didn't see it. And I face planted and wound up in the ER for 3 hours with teeth wired and some sewing work done. And I have 31 and a half teeth. And a couple of things. One is that I tell graduate students, if you get to your dissertation defense in one piece, you're doing better than I did. And secondly, the dissertation defense was kind of exciting because if anyone out there like me is a Warner Brothers cartoon fan and remembers Sylvester the cat, I was pretty much spraying the entire committee. So I think they approved the dissertation just to get out of there and get dried off.
Hey, it was pre-COVID, so no problems.
Yeah, no, but no big issues then. So from there, I revised and eventually boredom brought out the book.
So one
Hey,
of
in
my
many
questions
ways,
was,
go ahead.
go ahead,
I was going
go
to say
ahead,
it's a
Niels.
quick one, 4 years between defense and publication of the book.
Quick
I have
turnaround.
to say that when I was writing it, I was thinking in terms of writing it as much for publication as I could. And I know there are a couple of schools of thought there, get the thing done, then fix it.
Hmm,
And probably because I was at the community college where my tenure did not depend on publishing a book.
hmm,
We didn't have to publish or perish. There was a little more freedom for me to take that approach.
hmm,
But it is strange that I was able to do it that quickly. But then my first PhD student did it too. Defended in 2000, came out, excuse me, 2020, came out with her book in 2024.
hmm.
Oh, and she did it with two kids. I don't have any kids, so I don't know how she did it.
Hmm.
That is a very good question.
Yes.
That is a very good question. Oh my.
So,
Well,
one of my questions that kind of as a follow-up to that, the origin, actually it's about a decade of preparation and research and composition for the dissertation.
Yes.
So a structural thing that I really enjoyed, um, despite the fact that there are end notes, the notes are at the end of each chapter,
Hmm.
because of course we all hate end notes, of course, of course, of course.
Agreed.
But at least they're not very far from the text that you're reading, so you can flip easily to them, and they're there.
And that was a Fordham stylistic thing, which I appreciated. I would have loved to have had the notes at the bottom of the page. It makes my life easier, and
hmm,
I like it that way. But at the very least, I didn't have to sit there either putting in a bunch of bookmarks or post-it notes
hmm.
or trying to spread my hand out to get
Yeah,
from
yeah,
the text to the notes.
yeah, it's terrible. Yeah.
And I
Uh,
wish more would do that sort of thing.
yeah, but does anyone even publish footnotes anymore in terms of academic
Uh,
presses?
that's
I'm not aware of any,
a
and
good
it
question.
bugs me.
What's
I
the
hate.
Yeah, why is it always end notes now, not footnotes?
I think it's just easier. And the funny thing is, it was so much harder when the technology was less advanced.
Hmm.
I go back far enough to where my undergraduate advisor, wonderful historian named Ralph Roski, would require students to do footnotes. And I do mean footnotes. And it was a typewritten page.
Oh, good God.
And I cursed him a lot as I sat there trying to figure out where the footnote would begin.
Where does the line start? And
Yes.
ouch.
And a
Oh,
lot of
God.
paper was harmed in the production of this paper or term paper. And yeah, it just strikes me it would be so much easier for us to read. It would make a better experience. And I don't see the difference, frankly, when you've got a computer now that can do this.
Right.
And
It's
in
probably a difference
Fordham's
in
case, it was nice, but it was also interesting to me as I looked back and thought about it that the endnotes are the same type size.
Hmm.
They're not smaller,
so there's
which
no point.
reduced the squinting, I guess.
Uh, so my actual question was, okay, so the sources that you use
Mhm.
were just incredible. I mean,
Well, thank you.
you of course use the congressional record. You've got pretty common sources like Lincoln Papers, Library of Congress, but you really fan out. I mean, essentially anybody who is anybody in the Republican Party apparatus from the 1850s through at least the beginning of Reconstruction is in there somewhere. How on earth did you compile source material for those people? Where did you find? I mean, did you visit? No, go ahead. I'll just leave it at that.
Well, no, it's as I think back on it, a lot of very pleasant time at the Library of Congress and 3 months at the Huntington Library, graduate student funding and all that. And the Huntington's correspondence, primary materials are great. So is the secondary material,
Hmm.
so that I was able to dig into collections that had been published. And of course, the Columbia libraries. And being in New York City meant the New York Public Library, the New York Historical Society. And then it was a bit quirky where else I would end up. Uh, I think it often has something to do with whether you can find someone to stay with. I have a good friend from graduate school who lived in Philadelphia, so some time at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, which always struck me as strange that they have the Salmon Chase papers, because you don't think of Chase in Pennsylvania necessarily. And I had and have a dear friend from grad school, Wang Shi, another Eric Foner student. And she and I went up to New Hampshire, to the New Hampshire Historical Society, which meant getting into the weeds a bit with people like William Chandler and George Fogg. And I got a 2 week fellowship at the Lilly Library at Indiana University, which also had some interesting characters. And I will confess that a couple of friends and I exchanged some computer disks. Happily, there are many in our profession who do believe in that sort of thing, and I'll out him. Michael Vorenberg was doing the dissertation that became Final Freedom on the 13th Amendment, and I spent a week at Harvard mining that collection and brought along stuff, and I said, "Here you go," and he said, "Here you go." So I never made it to the Chicago Historical Society, but there it was, and he never made it to the Lilly Library, but there he was. And I am reminded that we may seem to work alone in a library, but it's a very collaborative process in so many ways.
Hmm.
And then, of course, newspapers. And I belonged to that era where we had to sit there and crank the microfilm machine,
I saw
which
that.
was which was not terribly appealing.
Nope. And you
But I
probably still
spent
had to
plenty
go
of
through
time.
each page and kind of,
Well,
Have to
and I
adjust
remember
the.
this is a fun one to talk about for the technical side. I have a Macintosh, and there was no Mac laptop. So I had a PC laptop where I eventually had to translate everything. But I took it with me to the libraries, and I'd sit there taking notes. And I'll never forget a famous scholar of Latin America and enslavement, Herbert Klein, who was at Columbia. And all of the, I guess I'll call them compartments or cubicles in the microfilm room were attached. And one day he came over and said, "Could you slow down the typing a little? You're shaking the whole thing." So it also helped that I'm a fast typist.
oh, Andrew, you're gonna appreciate that, like where he says that. I was in the Archive Diplomatique in La Courneuve once, and I was taking pictures with my DSLR camera of the microfilm,
Yeah.
and this lady comes up and is like, "That's pretty loud. It's really annoying."
Oh, because you had the click 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 going. Oh,
Yes.
jeez. Yeah. Archives are pretty quiet here.
Mm.
Archives do tend to be quiet, and I can remember the New York Historical Society had just closed the reading room for some renovations, reopened it, and hadn't bothered with the idea that it might be helpful to have outlets in the middle of the room for people with computers. So everybody with a computer was sort of up against a wall.
Last time I was in the
Yes.
archives in the States, I was in it was at University of Tennessee in Knoxville
Hmm.
and the special collections, and there was a lot more talking than I was used to, and it was annoying.
That's Tennessee.
But they did have outlets at every station, which was great.
Well, and I have warm memories of how at excuse me, at the Huntington Library, you had to return everything at 11:45 for lunch, and the bell would ring, and there'd be one bell, a ding, and then as it got closer, ding, ding. And then if you weren't in yet, ding, 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 ding. And I remember I spent a week at the University of Rochester going through the William Henry Seward and Thurlow Weed papers. And I was pounding away the first day, and they came over at close to noon and said, "Okay, it's time to go to lunch." I said, "Oh, no, I'm fine. I'll keep working." No, we want you to go to lunch. And it turned out they were just concerned everybody was eating.
Really?
I don't think it was personal.
Huh.
I have such great memories of archives and archivists in a day. The entire staff of Columbia's Rare Books room was gathered around me, and we were sitting there with a magnifying glass trying to puzzle out somebody's handwriting and how dependent we are on these people who
Mm,
do this incredible work that enable us to do any work.
Hmm.
mm. No, true, true.
And then, of course, they'll start gossiping with you if you're there long enough, so you know who's mad at whom.
Uh, well, I don't think Andrew and I ever had long enough in the archive experience for that.
No, it's always been, yeah, it's always been
These days it's like
punctuated
so
by
quick that you go through and
that's
take
it.
pictures and
Oh
Analyze
yes,
it later and
yep.
yeah, they,
yeah.
the total difference of the budgets we have available. Um, but I guess the big one here is let's start with a fun one, right? Like, so Doris Kearns Goodwin got
Mm.
turned into a movie, got a Pulitzer Prize, but she didn't write anything other than you. Why didn't you do it?
Well,
Well,
in fact, there are two paragraphs that essentially sum up the entire film Lincoln. Uh,
I
His
remember
book, right?
the story of
yeah,
Spielberg
yeah,
optioning it. And I thought to myself, how do you option a fact? That's how I looked at it. And I enjoyed the book. And I would say it's partly that it's Doris Kearns Goodwin who writes bestsellers and has a reputation. And it's partly that it looks more interesting, certainly to Steven Spielberg, to see Team of Rivals than Lincoln and his party during the Civil War, which is fine. But I was thinking as I watched the movie, and I enjoyed the movie very much, that I thought I had read about this in Vorenberg's book and in Lawanda and John Cox's book. And there wasn't that much Doris Kearns Goodwin, which is fine. I have had a couple of encounters with Hollywood and TV, and it didn't go that well, so maybe I'm better off. I don't know. And I like to recall when I saw the movie and we walked out, and my wife turned to the friends we were with and said, "It couldn't have been too bad. He only grunted once."
So now, well, now you open the door. Where did you grunt?
I grunted. I knew this was coming. At the scene where he slaps Robert,
Okay.
and that's just not plausible. And I know it's meant to give Joseph Gordon-Levitt a good scene, but I'll engage in a little anecdotage. I was at the Lincoln Forum the time after the movie had come out that they had Tony Kushner there. And they were taking questions, and so our table was trying to come up with a question. We all agreed the right question was, why did he slap Robert? How could you? And I get in line, and Harold Holzer is conducting the discussion. And he says, "Well, we have time for two more questions." And I count, and I'm the third in line. I think, "Okay, Harold, you miserable." And I'm heading back to the seat when I hear the next person say, "So, how could you have him slap Robert?" Well, good. I didn't get up there going, humana, humana, humana. And the answer was pretty much, well, we took some dramatic license, etc. Uh, and of course, there are problems. There are these little nitpicky things in some cases. The dialogue, of course, has to be invented, in part because we can't have all that. But it did capture, I thought, Lincoln's combination of ideology. This is what I need to do. This is what I believe, but also political horse sense, which was a problem for me because I made the comment in the book that with the war going on, they didn't spend as much time as they had before the war when they were out of power discussing what they were thinking about. They
mm,
were talking more about doing. So it's less of an intellectual or ideological history, I think, than free soil, free labor, free men, and more's the pity. But I went with what I had.
mm.
Your turn, Andrew.
Well, the three pillars of Republican of wartime Lincoln's wartime Republican ideology are fantastic. And
Thank you.
you really one of the things I really did enjoy was the fact that you tied it really well together with the freedom, the liberty, and the power all the way through. And you have this idea of power that shines through from beginning to end.
Well, I appreciate that. And being interested in politics and political ideology and political culture, I found it interesting that you had people who were not accustomed to being in the majority.
Mm,
They had spent a lot of time on the fringes. And now here they are in this position. Now, Lincoln, Seward, and others certainly had wielded power in certain times in their lives and had political know-how. But there was the line where Sumner is talking about a bill and he said, "It sleeps in my committee room." Yes, they figured this thing out. Now, part of the book is about the arguments about it. Who has the real power? Is it the executive or the legislature? What role does the judiciary play? And even within those branches, who? And this is something they did talk about and debate. And it was interesting to me when I think about politics then and now, as I was working on it in the 90s and early 2000s, and now as I look back at it, that the party system we now know was very new to them. And they were, I would think, less committed to a particular political party at that point than we tend to be now.
Mhm.
And if you think of the fact that in the 1850s you had this kind of kaleidoscopic change involving Democrats splitting, the Whigs dissolving, the Know Nothings popping up and going away, the Constitutional Union Party, well, I used to put it on the board and I'd put up CU as an abbreviation. I say it's kind of appropriate. See you. They were gone pretty quick. And then, of course, the Republican Party becomes the Union Party during the war. And this leads to a debate, and I make a reference to it, about who was the first true Republican president. Because Lincoln, for most of the war, would not technically call himself a Republican. I think he was a Republican. I think they were still Republicans. But it's handy to use the term
mm,
union. And that too relates to their idea. How do we keep power? How do we attract people to the party? They knew they were a regional party. And I think of Lincoln trying to get a Southern Unionist
Mhm.
and not being able to do it because they were so rare. That was one reason. And his greatest mistake, which was letting Andrew Johnson on the ticket,
mm,
a Southern Unionist, and we know what happened after that. And so all of these things that they still believed, but realized, oh, now we have power and responsibility, and can we implement these beliefs? And they struggle, as is natural. And in the end, they have an incredibly successful administration in a lot of ways. A strange statement to make if you think of 750,000 people dying. That isn't what they wanted, obviously. But if you think in terms of their legislation, both constitutional amendments and congressional legislation, they accomplished an incredible amount.
Mhm.
You want to pick that up with Andrew Johnson because that's
Well,
your baby?
well, I mean, the only thing that I would ask about that is, do you think that there would have been any way to foresee how Andrew Johnson might have been a poor choice?
I don't think they could have foreseen
No.
that.
Well,
And
and
it's easy in retrospect,
yeah, yeah,
of course, but that's what we do.
yeah, that's right. Well,
But
and
I have to say I do try in any history I'm doing, and I think we all do, to put ourselves in the shoes of the people we're writing about.
without,
Say, why are they doing this?
that's right.
And Andrew Johnson made a great deal of sense in
Hmm.
1864.
Yeah.
I'll bring this to my home state. There's been a historiographical debate about this. Nevada became a state a little more than a week before the election.
Mm.
And in the Lincoln Papers, there's a list of the electoral votes in the states. And the expectation was he would win 117 to 114. Then they add that three for Nevada, 120. Oh, now we have breathing room. Well, of course, it's 212 to 21. Now we know. Did they know then? Of course not.
Yeah.
And I didn't know the line at the time. We had a longtime Nevada politician, governor, U.S. Senator named Richard Bryan, and he likes to say to this day there are two ways to run for office, unopposed or scared. And I think Lincoln, being a smart politician, was scared. And I
Well, and
think
you
his
pretty
party
well
was
demonstrate
scared.
that as well. I mean, in your
Yes. And
when you
Andrew
discuss,
Johnson made sense.
oh, well, and just jumping back on that, so for the first, I don't know, third of the book, um, you talk a lot about free soil, about free labor and power, right, as two of the main
Mhm.
um, links in that chain,
Mhm.
or really the two main pillars that would lead to emancipation, that would keep the union together, that would, you know. So in those terms, Andrew Johnson only fulfilled one, not both of those requirements.
You know, you can see him as a free labor advocate eventually in terms of supporting the end of slavery. But this is where the ideology, the belief system becomes more important. Did he want to end slavery for the same reason Republicans wanted to end slavery?
Mm.
And I think we see in Johnson the idea that he is going to teach these people a lesson after they had been so nasty to him.
That's right.
And that revenge can be a well served dish, obviously. But if that's the case, Lincoln was talking to people like Frederick Douglass and thinking and evolving. He did not, as the line goes, start out perfect and then get better. And Johnson didn't really evolve in that way.
It never did.
No. And I think that's crucial to understanding him.
Mm.
He is a prisoner of his background in the way that a lot of us are.
Mm.
Mm. Yeah.
And he never quite escaped that background.
No. But he really did aim for the power, and
He
for
did,
him,
and union. I mean, he certainly,
power,
yeah,
union and power. Yeah.
yeah,
That's what I meant. But the emancipation, abolition was merely, expedient
yes.
politically.
No, I agree. And I think that, of course, Lincoln and Republicans came at it from different directions, but even then, they were headed toward the idea, at least, of restricting slavery from the outset, and eventually to the idea of getting rid of it entirely. And I don't think Johnson was thinking in those terms. Nor, to be fair, were some other war Democrats. And I found the Blairs fascinating.
Mhm.
Uh, Granted that nobody can read Montgomery Blair's handwriting. One of the lines I've encountered in writing history is that it's hard to do a biography of Blair because you can't figure out quite what he's putting on the page. And he talked about getting rid of slavery from the perspective of let's get rid of it and eliminate the Republican Party's reason for existence. We can all get back to being Democrats. And he takes a vastly more conservative approach than a lot of Republicans, though my argument is he's still headed to the same end. He's just going there by a different route.
So, Niels, do you mind if I jump on again?
Sure. I'll get to
Uh,
Seward eventually.
because the reason I say this is because Michael, you've touched on a couple of little key points that I really were thought provoking in the book and kind of reminded me of the European situation, which Niels and I often end up talking about. So this is going to be the kind of foray into that. um, you you've hinted on it in the last couple of minutes. You've talked about differences in placement, kind of on the spectrum of where where people were situated in terms of the Republican Party. So with with Montgomery Blair being probably at the extreme conservative end, but in the book, of course, you're talking about Chase being at the opposite end, and it being a sort of flow chart of different belief systems into that amalgamated into one coalition that eventually took power and asserted its power, which is essentially, and I don't know where heard this on a podcast not long ago. It might have been on Civil War Talk Radio. About the difference between one of the main differences between the American party system and say European party systems is that the coalitions in Europe form after legislative elections,
Yes.
whereas the coalitions in American politics happen before the elections. Um,
It's a fascinating difference. And I do go into this in the book, reaching back to what I always think is the important Richard Hofstadter book that gets lost in the shuffle, the idea of a party system. And his hearkening back to the founding fathers who opposed parties. And then, of course, now I think we understand Martin Van Buren was important to this process and creating parties. And in the case of the Republican Party, they do coalesce around this major issue of stopping the spread of slavery. And then they have the political problem that I guess Madison foresaw. You're going to disagree on other issues, but in this case, they're in the party for the moment. And again, I tend to think that we lose sight of the newness of the party, of the changes that had happened in the system, so that they may have been a bit more European then in terms of forming coalitions where it was not that big a deal for a party to die because they couldn't get together on other issues as opposed to today. And you see after the war, for example, the Blairs go back to the Democratic Party, which Montgomery Blair kind of foreshadowed in his correspondence during the war, talking about how if the Democrats would just accept that slavery's ending, we can get back to where we were. And it would have been very interesting. It's one of those great what ifs. What if we had that kind of parliamentary system? And there's a moment during the war when the Senate, as a body, among Republicans at least, with one exception, essentially tell Lincoln, you have to get rid of your Secretary of State. And Lincoln instead diddles them. I mean, he buries them to where they aren't going to do that. And I think that moment is important historically in terms of executive and legislative relations. And you can take this back to the beginning, where I guess George Washington at one point said he wanted to come testify before Congress, and they said, "No, we'll call you if we want you." And to this day, of course, if you give the State of the Union address, they technically have to invite you.
Hmm.
And we aren't seeing that quite so much these days in American politics, that sense of the legislative and the executive having different views. But that has existed through time. I
Yeah,
wandered all over the map there.
well, no, but yeah, it's really funny because that was kind of the logical follow up of what I was gonna of what I was talking about, because you talk about it was really parliamentary style government at the beginning of the coalition, and with Seward essentially taking the role of the premiership.
Mhm. And you know, there are similarities there historically in the United States, where the Secretary of State was considered, and with logical reason, the most important cabinet position. And they had just come out of James Buchanan having Lewis Cass, essentially to honor an old time Democrat while Buchanan would do his own foreign policy. But you also have the Whig notion that the president is supposed to defer to the legislature and to the cabinet. And I always say Whigs tended to believe that until they got a president. Then the president might feel a little differently. And
But then they died, of course.
yes, then they died. The Whigs did have that problem, didn't they? What a lucky group. Um, and Seward, for logical, understandable reasons, thought, I'm going to run the show. And I think we tend to forget both fellow Whigs before Republicans, so he would think, well, he's thinking that way anyway. But there's the story that's told of the man who went to see Seward and said, I must have this position. Seward said, I'll do my best. And then he said, you can't imagine my disappointment if I don't get it. And Seward said, I can't imagine your disappointment when I'm here and that prairie lawyer is in the White House. And in the end, of course, Seward becomes a close ally of Lincoln. And I would say the closest friend Lincoln had in Washington. And it took a while for Seward to be disabused of the notion. But the parallel I loved to point out, it was fun to do it in lectures from 2009 to 2013. I said, imagine the less experienced Illinoisan being elected president and asking the senator from New York with more experience in Washington to be his Secretary of State. Never happened before, right?
It's a great parallel. It
Oh,
really is a great parallel.
It was irresistible.
gotta bring it in.
All right, Niels, I've dominated this conversation long enough.
Well, you stole my topic. Even better. Of course, Seward
I
was
know
sort of
that feeling. I know that feeling. When I was working on the dissertation, I had this idea and I'd written it down. And a couple of years go by and a book comes out, and I'm pretty sure it was by Harold Holzer. And Harold had a reference where I said to myself, that I thought of that, but I hadn't gotten it out. So great minds, et cetera, et cetera.
Sorry, Niels.
no, no worries. I did want to talk about Seward because I thought that since you had Andrew Johnson, I can at least get my baby, Mr. Seward, in a little bit as a foreign
Ah,
policy hack. But no,
so
that's
I have to tell this. I went to Eric Foner's office one day and I said, I'm having a little issue and I wonder if you could help me. And I said, I am sitting here doing this research and I'm agreeing with everything Charles Sumner says, but I
that's
can't stand it.
that's really bad.
Yeah. And I am disagreeing with Seward, but I love him. And Foner said, I didn't put it quite in those terms, but I remember Foner looking at me and saying, I'd be worried about you if it was otherwise. Though I have to say, Sumner eventually had the line along the lines where Lincoln said, we are 6 weeks ahead of me. And
Uh,
Sumner said, well, then I can wait. And I can sit there from this distance and say, well, I wish we'd emancipated everybody right away and done all of the things that Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens thought about. But when I was an undergraduate taking diplomatic history from a guy named Andy Fry, who subsequently did a book on Lincoln and Seward,
Oh,
I
I'm not going to
remember
share
him,
my opinion on that book.
well, and he said in class that Seward is widely considered among diplomatic historians the second greatest Secretary of State behind John Quincy Adams. And we can always debate all those things, but Seward was a very consequential Secretary of State, both for diplomacy and for what he did in the administration.
Yeah, but kind of where do you feel like, but of course, a lot of historians usually say sort of the April Fool's Day memorandum is sort of the place where Seward gets the message of like, nope, Lincoln is running the show himself. Where do you see him kind of getting that? Like, yep, I'm just going to be a very important advisor as Secretary of State and not supreme.
I do think that memo plays an important role
Hmm.
in his understanding of that. And it's not so much what the memo says as how Lincoln handles it.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yes.
done in private. There's no public upbraiding or anything like that. And I think Seward graphs, no, this guy has a notion of what's going on. And then I go back to the secession winter when Seward is talking more about compromise, but does he really mean it? And this is where the Charles Francis Adams connection fascinated me because Adams was the one who said, well, let's bring New Mexico in. It'll be a slave state. So Sumner, on his purely moral pedestal, thinks this is the worst thing anyone could ever do. And Adams and Seward's clearly involved with what Adams is doing, are saying, no, we're thinking in terms of how do we mold public opinion. And I've wondered at times if Seward had had a little too much brandy at certain points, but I tend to think no, Seward was an operator
Hmm.
in much the way Lincoln was an operator. And that's one of the things that brought them together. Both of them were political animals, but in a different way than, say, Salmon Chase, who, for one thing, could never see the gamesmanship, and secondly, had no hint of a sense of humor.
That must have been hard for you to read his papers.
Yes. He was a less enjoyable way to spend time. Granting that Seward annoyed me because he'd be writing a letter to whoever, Thurlow Weed or someone else in New York, and say, something big has happened. I will have to tell you about it when I see you.
Ah,
You miserable so and so.
oh, we all have those stories.
Oh, we
Ah,
all do. We all do.
ah, of course, Seward. Hmm. Um, but I'm going to change gears here a little bit
Okay.
because I want to say the first time that I saw you ever in person was at the Society of Civil War Historians in Chattanooga. It was a
I
Megan Kate Nelson show. You all had to sit in front of the tables instead of the back of the tables, and she was very rigidly of like, you don't get more time than these 2 minutes to talk in this round table, and then we do questions and uh
You had to
um
sit in front of the table?
yep, they had to sit in the front of the table and
No hiding behind.
nope, no hiding. Like it was yeah, it was very
don't look
interesting.
down at your notes to see
Yeah.
what you were going to do.
Yeah, but as a result, I often kind of think of you also as sort of the Civil War in the West, the American West historian. So
Uh,
you're probably already seeing where this is going. Uh, when I read your book, I saw a lot of the East, like the power center, and I felt the West was a little missing in that. So how do you feel
Mhm.
20 years on about that?
Well, I'm going to go back to that little list I had
Hmm.
that I shared with Eric Foner. So remember, this is around 1990.
Yeah.
And one of my topics, very generally, I said, was the Civil War in the far West.
Ooh.
And that was the one where he paused. And then he said, "That is your third book."
Hold on,
And
let me
I looked
look.
at him funny. And I now understand what he was saying. He had to explain it at the time. And it was this. He said, "I don't say this with ego, but I put out this book on Reconstruction and it made a splash. If my next book was the Civil War in the West, people would say, this is an important topic. If you are coming out with it as your first book, it's not going to get the attention it deserves."
Hmm.
And Patty Limerick told me the story of a major scholar of the Civil War era saying to her, "You're very good. Why are you wasting your time on the West?" And her response in her head, she did not want to get this historian angry at her, was, "Well, what do you think they were fighting over?"
Hmm.
And I did try to convey some of that with the chapter on the legislation like the Homestead Act
Hmm.
and the Pacific Railroad Act. But it was one of the rare times I've thought in my life and career that I was ahead of the curve. I saw this as important at the time. And I've since poked around the edges, and I still want to get to the Civil War in the West when I escape. And note I say when and escape from being department chair. There are a couple of projects I have going on, and then I want to get to that and get, in a sense, back to Lincoln and the Civil War. But Republicans were fighting for the West.
Hmm. Yeah.
And if you think about the idea that slavery's spread has to stop,
Hmm.
well, where would it spread? Well, the answer is the West. And I think that historians have had the tendency to minimize the West. And this is quasi related in the sense that I teach a big lecture hall called The Meaning of Freedom in American History.
Hmm.
And it's designed, frankly, to meet a couple of requirements so students can get through UNLV faster, and I get that. And so the first part is on the Revolution and the Constitution. The second part is on slavery and the Civil War and Reconstruction. The third part is the modern rights movement. So we have to
Hmm.
go into the U.S. and Nevada constitutions, which I do in the first two parts. And for the third part, I noticed that the books that focus on the civil rights movement, so you're talking black civil rights, women's rights,
Hmm.
student movement, etc., there isn't much on Chicano rights
Hmm.
when you look at that stuff. And I think that tends to be because it came out, for most people's minds, it's a much broader issue, but it came out of the West and the great fields of California. And Californians, or at least Cesar Chavez came from Arizona, Dolores Huerta from California. And so there was more of a bias, I think, when I was originally writing this about whether the West was that important. And I think the discussion is still going on. Gary Gallagher has made clear he doesn't buy this. And Megan Kate Nelson would make him sit on the other side of the table for this one.
I would
And
love
I
to
don't
put those
blame
two in a room.
her. We could sell tickets.
Yes. Probably need an ambulance too.
We just might. But I can remember some historians who said to me that no, there's more to this topic,
Hmm.
and we're seeing more done on it. But it's interesting that the most important scholarly article that's associated now with the issue is Elliot West,
Hmm.
aptly named as a Western historian. but the greater Reconstruction. And I think that is a good, different, and in many ways correct way to look at what was happening in that period.
So
And I
just
confess, when I'm teaching it, I throw in a little bit of, did you notice that Mexico is having some issues and China is having issues and Bismarck is doing things in Germany and we get the Reform Bill of 1867 in Great Britain and a variety of Italian unification.
No, you can
We,
dismiss
we
that.
can see, yeah, we can see a worldwide set of developments here. Does the United States fit in with that? I don't think Lincoln and Seward are even sitting there saying, well, Italians are doing this and Germans are doing that, so we should therefore do this. But something's going on.
Mhm.
hmm.
Where's that one?
Well, go ahead.
There's that book.
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Well, I had a different question, but yeah, actually, the so this is out of my wheelhouse, completely out of my wheelhouse. But your discussion in that free labor chapter of labor and capital being intrinsically linked for the free soil people, for the free labor people. Was that we're talking about Europe, talking about what's happening in talking about Germany, talking about what's happening in Italy. For me, thinking about the liberal revolutions of 1848, is this kind of a residual uh, economic
Hmm.
effect of the 1848 revolutions? Liberal revolutions, I'm talking.
Yeah. And I admit I wasn't thinking in those terms then, but I do think there is some of that going on, especially when you consider that some of the revolutionaries then come to the United States
Mhm.
and are having influence
Mhm.
within the Republican Party, certainly. Carl Schurz, Gustav Korner, and so on. So I do think
Wait,
there
that's how
is
you
some of
pronounce that
that.
guy?
I don't know how you say
The
these
the
now.
the, the guy from Poland.
No,
Yeah,
Kerner.
my thing has always been I could spell very well, but don't ask me to pronounce. So the first day of class, I always say, I'm going to butcher your name, so please correct me. And then some of them said, wow, I'm surprised you came that close. But
Anyway,
this
sorry.
but this idea of free labor certainly has been circulating in the United States long
Mm,
before the 1848 revolutions. But I do think there's an awareness.
mm,
And if you think of politicians then having less access to diverse sources of information than we do today, but also probably knowing their sources of information better than we do today,
So, yeah,
they're aware of this. They know what's going on. And I do think there is some impact.
because this would be the kind of aftershock of the Communist Manifesto and
mhm,
Louis Blanc's work on socialism, the place of labor, free labor, the place of capital, the importance of capital in the whole mix, and the workings of government and power the capital actually held uh, in the right well for the person in charge.
Yes, and Lincoln gave this speech in 1859 that is important to what I wrote here and certainly was important to what Eric Foner wrote, Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Men. And labor, independent of capital, comes before capital. And Lincoln then cribs from himself in his first annual message in 1861. I figure if Lincoln wants to plagiarize himself, he's perfectly welcome to. Uh, I better not, but it's okay if he does. And he is saying that at the same time that, of course, now Salmon Chase has discovered Jay Cook,
mhm,
and we have to finance this war. And how do we do that? And I think that's where we also begin to see where Republicans being in power, having responsibility for financing the government, suddenly are moving in different circles, so to speak. And this, I think, has some effect in the long term that, well, labor's great, but these guys don't seem too bad and they've helped us win the war.
Yeah,
Of course,
I have to say, I found it very fascinating of how there's just that little snippet of how you trace throughout the books this change of like this was a protest movement initially that didn't want the expansion of slavery into the West, that was effectively saying open this Western land to the little guy so they can farm. And then in the course of the war, with the massive expenditures in money and material, they're all of a sudden going like, yeah, workers are great, but we're really like these capitalists. We like these industrialists. And it's like it's almost like you this party that like had an ideology changes its ideology
mhm.
into a pro-industrial or a pro-industrialist ideology too.
It does, and it is harder to trace, partly because I don't think you're going to find a lot of correspondence where they're saying, "Well, I really liked workers until I met these capitalists."
Wouldn't that be nice, that smoking
Wouldn't it?
gun?
Nice to have the smoking gun. Burn this letter, as James Blaine said. But again, I do think this goes back to running the government.
Hmm.
And this happened long after I'd done any research and written this book. But of all things, Chuck Schumer, yeah, the Democratic Senate leader,
Hmm.
was on the Daily Show. And it was at the time he was trying to water down the Dodd-Frank bill that would involve banking regulation. And Jon Stewart was really giving it to him. And Schumer at one point said, "Well, John, you tend to forget Wall Street's in my district." And whatever I feel about how we should be responding to things, it was one of those boing moments for me where I said, "Oh, yeah, that's right."
Hmm.
And I thought, yeah, and I grew up in a state where gaming and mining are the two major economic forces. And we had the Senate Majority Leader, who was a great environmentalist, Harry Reid. A lot of people don't realize all that he did for the environment, but if it involved mining, he wasn't letting you touch it. And I go back to someone from whom I hope I learned something about writing because he was my favorite columnist and writer, Russell Baker of the New York Times, where he said, I wanted to convey as a reporter covering the Senate that Lyndon Johnson was also the senator from the Texas oil companies,
Hmm.
and the guy from Georgia represented Coca-Cola. And I had not read that yet. Actually, I had read what Baker said, but that in a way had an impact in how I was thinking about this. And yeah, railroads are important, and suddenly they're going to do things for railroad builders that they might not have done before they were
Hmm.
in a position to do something about it. They would have said, "Oh, we can't support this." And now, well, we need that railroad. So, well, if we need to do that, I guess we'll do that. And suddenly, free labor uh, means the freedom to labor. And I guess for the building of the railroad, cheap labor.
In many ways, it's very modern Republican Party, right? Considering what's the modern Republican Party in the South with the right
Sorry,
to
Huckabee
work
Taylor's.
state stands for.
And in Nevada, we're right to work.
Oh yeah, okay.
And that was done, well, with Democrats. But of
Hmm.
course, the parties have changed. And that's where, if you compare past and present, there were Democrats in the Civil War who were very much pro-union and worked with the Lincoln administration. There were Democrats who fought them tooth and nail. And we see the divisions in the Republican Party during the Civil War. And today, there are still some divisions, but for the most part, the parties are anchored in certain ideas and they're not moving.
which is completely the opposite of what you're talking about in this book.
Yes,
How fluid everything is all
yes.
the time. And you talk about Seward going back and forth, or Greeley going back and forth. Uh,
Well, and Greeley, mind you, I think there are other issues. There, uh, or I'll invoke Foner because I've used the line in class for years. I referred to Greeley, and he said, "Oh, there's an unguided missile," and he was. And of course, he and Seward and Weed had this great partnership that broke up. And it broke up mainly because Greeley was upset that Seward and Weed wouldn't support him for office because they knew he was going to go in multiple directions. Can they trust him to do what they want? And I always thought Seward was more radical than conservatives thought, and more conservative than radicals thought. It kind of depended on the moment and the issue. And I don't go into the post-war period for logical reasons, but he stays with Andrew Johnson and goes along with Johnson. And how much of that is Seward's belief system changing, and how much of that is Seward thinking, I don't have any political capital. If I want to do the things I want to do as a diplomat, then I'm going to go along here. And how much of it was, well, we've ended slavery. Now we're all free to labor.
Well, and then
And
he becomes the imperialist eventually, right? Like,
yes,
I mean, that's,
and
and he's,
and he'd always had
yeah,
imperialist tendencies, depending on how we define imperialism at a given moment.
yeah.
Think about Thomas Nast's depictions of Seward
Ah,
under Johnson.
yes, brutal and well, while I love Seward, kind of deserved.
Sycophant. I mean,
I should put a picture of that up now for those that view it.
I'm not sure the word nasty came from Nast, but
Well,
it
there
could
we
have
go.
been them damn pictures, as Boss Tweed said.
Um, well, I'm going to go with one more kind of modern issue because I think that was a very, guess, disturbing aspect of the chapter on the legalities that you had
Hmm.
because, and that's like Duncan and I when we wrote the book on the Civil War and the Age of Nationalism, we very much were kind of thinking and like we wanted to do realpolitik, and Lincoln has sort of like he does whatever it takes to keep this nation together again. That we knew would potentially annoy some Civil War Lincoln loving historians, but you very much kind of do this too in that, it's like it's a question between freedom and union. And if you have to sacrifice freedom temporarily to achieve union, it's a worthwhile sacrifice.
Must all the laws be enforced, as
Yes.
Lincoln asks, or do we just not enforce this one?
Yeah.
It's a tough one. And I think of the Alan Guelzo line about the Lincoln Douglas debates, where Lincoln is talking about essentially claiming he is a white supremacist and refers to it as the sentence everyone who loves Lincoln wishes that he had never said. And then Niels and I have talked about my book on Lincoln and Native Americans, and there are a
Mhm.
couple of moments in there where you're thinking, what are you doing?
Yeah.
And in our present moment, we look at that and say, well, that was during an insurrection. Are we in the same position now? No. And I can take a political stand and I'll refrain from it, but I don't think it compares. At the same time, there are many scholars who would say, I think with justification, that Lincoln gives a justification to people to do things in the presidency that maybe he would look back on and say, I don't think you should be doing that now. Or maybe I wish I hadn't done it.
Mhm.
But it's interesting that he defies Tawney when Tawny's on circuit.
Mm,
The Merriman case is Tawney hearing it as the circuit judge, though Tawney will claim also to be, well, I'm the Chief Justice. Yes, but you're also hearing the case on circuit. And I think Lincoln was very conscious and careful about that. But I also think Tawney at that moment was unique. If we think of today's U.S. Supreme Court, there are certainly people who despise certain justices. And Tawney went beyond that for so many.
mhm.
And quote from Wade, I was praying for Tawney to stay alive long enough for Lincoln to make an appointment, and I think I overdid it. And the other criticisms. And in the end, the Supreme Court during the Civil War did not do some of the things it could have done. But I also think that Lincoln was quite conscious that a future president could revoke the Emancipation Proclamation, or the Supreme Court would say, well, it was for wartime, it doesn't apply now. And I once had a student who was very conservative early in the first Trump administration said, did Lincoln issue any executive orders? I said, I'm glad you asked me. Because he did.
Mhm.
And that is why he wanted a constitutional amendment, because executive orders can be overturned. Now we'll see about constitutional amendments, won't we?
I hope not.
I hope not, too.
Oh
I
boy.
think
That's pretty
birthright
scary.
citizenship is
Yeah.
pretty clear.
Well, that would depend on five judges or six justices on the Supreme Court, whether they agree or not.
Well, and as Justice Brennan once said in the 1960s, you just need to count to five.
Yes.
Do anything you want if you can count to five. And in
Mm.
the Civil War, well, at one point they had 10 justices. And I thought, oh, that could have been fun.
So the role that the Supreme Court played is pretty measured and downplayed in your book. I mean, they're not. It's not there very often, very much.
Mhm.
Is that
It's a
reflective of?
chapter. Yeah, part of a chapter.
Yeah, but I mean, even when you talk about the attempted coup uh, of Seward and Chase,
Hmm.
it seemed that there would be at least some transition to Chase and the Supreme Court.
This is something I would have liked to have done differently in the end, which is do more to take the story forward. And I have some reference to it, but the irony that then Chase overrules himself on legal tender, and well over a century later, John Paul Stevens, one of the longest serving justices ever, said something like, well, I wrote that opinion because that was the law, but it doesn't mean I agreed with it.
Hmm.
And he was referring to eminent domain. And in Chase's case, it's hard to know because Chase was so determined to be president, had the presidential maggot, as Lincoln called it. How much is he motivated
Mm.
by that? And how much of it is his being an old Democrat who, in the end, kind of goes back to the Democratic Party, but had been a free trader in an administration where the tariff mattered, speaking of current issues.
Mm.
And yeah, the thing that I admit I found interesting, where I thought it related to the overall point I was trying to make, is John Hale of New Hampshire introducing legislation to abolish the Supreme Court, which was going to go nowhere. But then, oh, we see this opportunity to reshape it,
Mm.
which they do. And an interesting comparison would be between Lincoln's justices and FDR's justices, where Franklin Roosevelt appointed these justices who all supported the New Deal. But when the issues changed, they hated one another, but they also disagreed fundamentally on civil liberties. Where the Republican Party would have gone in the Civil War and afterward, and the justices in question would make an interesting study.
It wasn't a critique. It
No,
was
no,
just
I welcome critiques. Um, I was looking back when you asked me to do this, and I looked back at reviews, and the
Oh,
late Bells did a supportive but critical review, and I met him and I thanked him. He took it seriously and he thought about
hmm,
what I'd said.
hmm,
And in fact, I wrote him a note originally, and he thanked me. He said it was very unusual for him to get that kind of note in response to a review.
hmm,
I've always thought that way when I'm writing a book review. Uh, the author is going to read it,
yeah,
and I want to be fair above all. If I'm critical,
not just
uh,
hurtful.
not just not hurtful. And I've read some hurtful reviews, not so much
yes.
of me. They haven't been too nasty. But
Good for
I
you.
also tell about somebody who said that this was a well-written book without a lot of original ideas, and someone else who said had a lot of original ideas but was hard to read.
So what do you believe then?
Yeah, I'm going to go with half of each. I think it's very well written and has a lot of original ideas.
I found it.
Bingo.
I found it very fluid, by the way. Just
Well,
in
thank you.
terms of
I appreciate that. And I do appreciate that. And I will make a little confession. I wrote a Nevada textbook. And in writing the textbook, I decided to honor the memory of Richard Hofstadter, something Foner said, but also other things I was told. And there are four verb forms that do not appear in the book except in a quotation: is, are, was, and were. Action verbs.
Hmm.
And I'll never forget Ralph Roski having me read Schlesinger's The Age of Jackson.
Oh.
And he said, "Did you notice anything?" And I had another professor, Gene Mooring, who worked with Schlesinger, and he pointed out the same thing: action verbs. And
Hmm.
Foner had to break me of this habit because Jackson would always declare, and Henry Clay would whine or claim, that
Hmm.
sort of thing. And uh, to his
Interesting.
eternal credit, Foner said that said is a good word.
uh,
Oh,
Niels. Go ahead.
we have to be good
By the way,
writers.
and something that's possibly relevant to this, I taught a graduate course on 19th century America, and I had students read The Age of Jackson,
Oh, you're
and I had a
cruel.
purpose. No, I had a purpose. And it was partly the writing. In fact, it was completely the writing. But this was in 2020, and students were incredibly critical, of course, of
Hmm.
various things in the book. And so then I read aloud to them Schlesinger saying, well, if I wrote the book today, of course I would talk about
Hmm.
Black people and Native Americans and women and that sort of thing. I was writing in a different time. And I would do a better job, I hope, today,
Hmm.
even though the profession certainly had changed enough by the 90s that this was going on. But in a
Well,
sense, it's high political culture.
Hmm.
I do have one criticism. Actually, it's a single word criticism.
Ha!
You
Okay.
use the word liberal
Mm-hmm.
when you talk about radicalism, or in today's parlance, liberal, and that got me.
Yeah. And especially because the word liberal meant something very different
Yeah.
in the 19th century.
Hmm.
And liberal Republicans, as my friend Andy Slapp will tell you, are not the same thing as liberals today. And yeah, I would like to change that. I would. I could think of many things I could change if I could, or I would change if I could.
Well, at least it didn't talk about the Democrat Party.
I, for a while, I started calling it the Republic Party.
Public.
As one does.
Yes, I think, if we're going to screw around with the adjectives here, If we're going to make adjectives out of nouns or vice versa.
The basic grammar of the thing is just, ugh.
What's
Yes.
grandma? I mean, we're in
Well,
the age of Twitter, 180
I
characters.
I salute Shay Cox, who wrote The Fabric of Civil War Society. It's sitting back there somewhere. She was my PhD student. And when she turned in her final draft, somewhere in there, she referred to how this move impacted the South. And I circled it and I said, not a verb. I don't care what people say. Its impact is not a verb unless it refers to wisdom teeth. And Shay, and we have this kind of advisor-student relationship. Shay said, "Well, actually, I was wondering how closely you were reading it.
Oh,
So I thought it would be fun to throw that in and see if you did notice."
That's fun.
Well, okay, you're allowed, but it goes.
man, I should have known that. I could have asked her about that when I did her interview a few weeks ago.
Well, I'm glad you interviewed her. She's wonderful, and it's a wonderful book.
Ah,
Her advisor
belatedly.
had her advisor had very little to do with that.
Well,
It's one
uh,
of it's on the list. I mean,
Oh, my list. Oh,
don't start.
hmm.
Lists are long, but actually, that's a great transition as we're kind of getting to the last quarter of our interview here. I just kind of out of curiosity did a little Google Scholar search, and apparently, according at least to Mr. Google, free soil, free labor, free man has been cited 2,525 times. I wish I made that up. That's actually a really odd number
We
to
got to
have.
get another one, so it's off of that.
Um, and Freedom, Union, and Power has a total of 37
ouch.
citations.
Well, that's why I
Um,
like to say between us, Eric Foner and I have won one Pulitzer Prize.
yes,
Yeah, he won it.
yes. But the where I want to go with this is sort of like, how do you kind of like, we have 20 years now, you had time to reflect on this, you have seen, you're very active as a scholar, you have kept up with sort of what's coming out. How do you feel you have impacted the profession? Do you feel like your book got sort of the attention you wanted it? Did you feel like there's some books recently that have come out where you're kind of like shaking your head and you're like, I wrote a book about this. Why didn't you read it? You're totally wrong.
I don't tend to think they're totally wrong when I read them. And yeah, it's not well cited. And I'm not being critical of Fordham University Press when I say Fordham is not Oxford University Press. And I certainly would not put myself in the same league as Eric Foner. I just don't. I wouldn't. And Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Men
Your
came
book is
out at
way
a,
more accessible than that, so
well, but
Mm.
it came out at a certain time
sure.
and I think was vastly better intellectual history than I wrote. And I can say part of that was the time I was writing about, and part of it was my talent in relation to the talent of the other author. You want to have an impact, and I don't think it has had a big impact,
Hmm.
which is fine, as much as I might like to have an impact. And I do think the book may suffer in terms of how people view it from the fact that it is a more traditional work of history than a lot of others. So if I had it to do over, might I try a different publisher? I was very happy with Fordham and with the editors. I don't know. But I might have ended up with a much shorter book
Hmm.
that would do certain things better.
Hmm.
And again, that's not a criticism of anyone but me. And I referred to being at the community college. I didn't feel I had to worry as much
Hmm.
as I might have if I had been one of my friends from school or the research trail at a four-year university or even an Ivy League or
Mm.
Research One university. I'm now at a Research One university, but that was done before all that. And I guess it helped me get there. And I published my dissertation as a book to respectable reviews, or Damon Runyon used to call it the medium hello. I thought was appropriate enough. So I wouldn't have minded having a bigger impact, but I'm content with the world I live in.
Yeah. So like like considering there's all the time new books on Lincoln. I guess we can talk about some Republican Party books that have come out in recent years, but just sort of like where do you see like the greatest hole still? Like what's left to be said?
I love to cite J.G. Randall's presidential address where he talks about, has the Lincoln theme been exhausted? And this is nearly a century ago. And the answer is no, it isn't. And nearly a century later, no, it isn't. But there are still a few things, and I admit I've thought about writing a couple of them. I'm I've long kicked the tires. I intend to do it. Lincoln in the West.
Mhm.
Dick Edelane, who made his name more as a Western history scholar, was working on that and has done some work there. And there have been some other things, but not so much Lincoln and the West as the Civil War and Reconstruction. And I think a Lincoln focus would not be bad. I think that we still have so much more to learn about Lincoln's early life, and I don't know if we can
Mhm.
learn it.
Hmm.
For Lincoln's bicentennial, I was asked to give this speech, and I pointed out the three most written about people in the English language are Jesus, Shakespeare, and Lincoln. I think it's still true. But I said one of
Is
the
that
things
true?
that
Is that still, yeah.
I think it's still true, but one of the things that unified those three people is how little we actually know about them. We don't know large segments of Jesus's life. We don't know large segments of Shakespeare's and Lincoln's. There's a lot of imagining that goes on, even with all the great stuff that Michael Burlingame has mined. We still have a lot we don't know. So can we find it out?
Mhm.
And I'm hoping that's possible. Have we learned everything we can know about Lincoln and the military? Probably close to it. But then I think of seeing it cited the other day, James McPherson's For Cause and Comrades, and then Yale Sternhell has written, others have written, of course, about the common soldier, for lack of a better
Mhm.
term, and what they were thinking and what they thought about Lincoln. Well, we will always find new stuff there.
Yeah.
So I don't think the Lincoln theme has been exhausted. Maybe I'm exhausted, but I like to think maybe I still have something else I can dig up
Mhm.
or have something to say or a different perspective. And I was in that series that Southern Illinois did, the Concise Lincoln Library, and someone was going to do a volume on Lincoln's mistakes
Mhm.
and realized they'd never be allowed to set foot in Illinois again.
That might be a good thing.
Might be good for them. You don't know. But there's always
Mm.
something to be done or redone, I
Yeah.
think. Uh, and I hope to contribute to the doing and redoing.
Um, was Lincoln the central character in this book?
I don't know that the book has a central character, but if there is a central character, it's Lincoln. And I think of him for that in that context partly because, well, yeah, he's president and he's ultimately the
mm,
most important decision maker, but also he's in the middle.
Hmm.
mm,
You can
Ideologically, you
have,
mean?
yes, ideologically, and he's in the middle in a lot of
mm,
ways. But if you think of someone like Sumner or Thaddeus Stevens at one end, and you think of, I don't think it's fair to put Seward completely as the most conservative. He's not. But if you think of the Blairs or Orville Browning,
mm,
but also the movement you see Lincoln
mm,
engaged in, where he starts at one point and what does he say in his final speech? Yes to black suffrage within limits.
mm,
But if he's gotten that far, how much farther is he going to go? Which, of course, is what occurred to John Wilkes Booth. And I just think frankly, he was easy to make a more central figure.
mm.
And maybe that's a point against me. There could have been other central figures.
But it made sense.
Well,
Like
I think it
you're right.
did. And still, there were others who.
But when you're discussing all the other people, um, you might have a couple of pages where Lincoln doesn't even appear.
Yeah. Oh, and that's intentional. Or I should say, well, no, I'm not talking about him here. So,
Right.
fine. And it's like a Lincoln biography. Even a Lincoln biography will have spots where he may
Mm,
disappear a little bit for a
Mm.
while we're addressing issues around him,
mm,
but he's still central,
mm,
kind of lurking on the fringes.
mm.
As it were.
Yes, I don't want to think of Lincoln as lurking, but maybe so. But I ran into this doing Lincoln and Native Americans.
Mm,
Lincoln is not talking about what's going on out in New Mexico, for example, but it's his appointees.
mm,
And in this case, Republicans in the Civil War, whatever they're thinking and doing, in the end, they have to deal with him.
right.
Well, I mean, you talk about responsibility, and responsibility was just that.
Yes.
Your turn, Andrew.
All right. So this is going to be my last question.
Oh, he always says that, Michael. Don't take
Well,
him
no, no,
serious.
no, no. I'm going to stick to it. I'm going to stick
I
to it.
would say in conclusion and go for another half hour. So
Mhm,
Uh, well, I'm going to try to stick to it. How about that? So, one of the interesting themes that I saw as well running through the book is the contemporary view of history. They either saw history as looking back or looking forward, how they were going to be viewed by history, or how history at in the 1860s, how history played a role in affecting change or pushing them to make certain decisions at certain times, ideologically speaking.
I
Is
think, yeah. Oh,
Go
sorry,
ahead.
go
No,
ahead.
go ahead. That wasn't really a question, but it was a
Excuse me.
statement that I think you can. Yeah.
And I appreciate it. And as I was researching it, I was struck by how often they would refer to what had come before them. And then I thought of a little known senator from Vermont, Jacob Collamer, was born in 1784.
mm,
And then Winfield Scott, their first commanding general, I think 1786. And wow, they were older than the Constitution.
mm,
And they are much closer to the founding fathers in so many ways than we are for logical reasons that I think they had more of a sense, gee, these guys were aware that history was looking at them,
mm,
and we are working more closely with them or against them, as the case may be, or thinking in terms of what they believed. And they are also coming out of a time where in the 1850s you have mostly Southerners, but some Democrats. What's the description of the Declaration of Independence? A self-evident lie. And I don't want to psychoanalyze I've enjoyed the works that did that, but I think we can overdo it for this group in particular, that they are thinking in terms of how we're trying to save the Union
Hmm.
that these people built. So we're going to be compared. And I think they read a lot more history
Yeah.
than we do today. Maybe they had fewer books to choose from, or fewer means of entertainment, shall we say. So I think they are very conscious of it in ways that I think we should be more conscious.
I suppose because it seems that today uh, people have forgotten about history and you know, as the axiom, you know.
Mm-hmm. And yet, I think that there's a lot of interest in history,
Mhm.
but I think the interest is expressed in different ways. They're going to watch some documentaries, some are very good and some are not, or they're going to see a movie and think that's it.
Mhm.
I've always taken the position I
YouTube
don't want.
University.
Yes, and I think drunk history is a lot of fun. I try not to do it, but I used to think, and I'm still inclined this way, that if something gets you into the tent, so to speak, gee, I watched this drunk history on Lexington and Concord or whatever. I wonder what the reality is. The danger is when they say, oh, of course, that's how it happened. But in honor of what goes on across the pond, one of my favorite books is still 1066 and all that. And as the authors say, this is not the history you were taught, it's the history you remember.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, that gives me the final question to kind of see where I'm taking this because in part I kind of was early already thinking when you mentioned Gozos's work briefly whether I'm gonna pick this up or not, but I think I'm going to because I mean he's a big Republican Party, Lincoln, Civil War era scholar. Um, um, but he very critically came out, for example, against the 1619 project. He was in that press conference that leads eventually to the 1776
Yes.
commission. Of course, on the other end of the spectrum, you have Heather Cox Richardson with sort of her polemics regarding sort of the way the Republican Party should get an epiphany and coming sort of out of the ivory tower downward to us. But how do you kind of indicated that your book didn't make a big splash. You're not constantly on TV. You're not posting every day on social media. You're not getting invited 4 times a year to be on a podcast. Like, how do you like? Do you feel like you would want to make more of an impact, or do you feel like some of these celebrity historians are overdoing it and kind of losing not being able to communicate it in that celebrity status, sort of the nuance of history.
Well, I think that some of the people we might call a celebrity historian do communicate that there's nuance. At the same time, and I say this not critically at all, Heather Cox Richardson and I are, I think, close friends. But if she is writing the daily
Hmm.
thing she's writing, her daily analysis, it's inevitable that she's going to talk about certain things in comparison. And I have written columns for local publications, so a much smaller scale, and I'll come back to that. But I have found that when you are in that sort of situation, you are going to come back to certain themes or ideas that appeal to you. And sometimes it's easier. And then I found myself in the position at one point of writing a column for a local publication and wanting to find a quote from somebody, going online and typing in the key words because I didn't remember exactly where the quote was, and finding that it was in another article I'd written, and I was essentially saying the same thing again. And I thought, well, uh, and I'm not talking about the big issues in this case, like Heather Cox Richardson was, but maybe it was something involving the sanitation service in Las Vegas. But that goes to the celebrity question. Because to my consternation and sometimes pleasure and sometimes displeasure, I'm a bit of a local celebrity because I do local history
Mhm.
and am interviewed frequently about Las Vegas. So in the coming week, I'm being interviewed for two different documentaries on very different Las Vegas area topics. And on the one hand, I want to be out there and make sure that the word is spreading, that there's history here. And on the other hand, I think, well, maybe I could be doing something else with that time, especially since they don't tend to pay. but but okay.
Neither do we.
No, and that's fine. I'm
Yeah,
happy to be
sorry.
here with you too. No, this is great. But because I do local things, I guess I get a certain degree of attention. Heather was doing a presentation out here, and the presentation was going to be that I would question her, and she wanted more of a conversation, which is great. But we were walking into the hall where the event would be, and there were these women saying, said, "Oh my God, it's Heather." And so we were teasing her about her groupies, and she has them.
Mhm.
But I have people who come up to me if I go to a pizza place and say, by the way, saw you on Channel 3 or whatever, and really enjoyed that. And, are you doing other things? Or you did a talk here, you're doing these other talks. So I'm conscious of it. And it may be that if I wanted to be a Civil War historian celebrity, and am not, that in another way makes up for it, though I'm not interested in being a celebrity. But if I were to be honest, and I will be, right now, I would be, if I had followed my childhood dream, and I still dream of it at times, probably getting ready to go to Dodger Stadium to broadcast tonight's Dodgers Yankees game as the Dodger radio announcer. So from an early age, I had come to the thought, well, I'm going to be recognized somehow. And so, in a way, it doesn't affect or bother me the way it might affect or bother others. And I get some attention, so maybe I figure I'm all right. Nobody has come up and screamed at me. A couple of people were upset. Uh, I get that. There were some local issues I mouthed off about. I also am on the professor watch list,
Oh, of
uh,
course.
thanks to something I
Surprise.
posted on Facebook. So maybe there's something to be said for anonymity.
So, in other words, you wanted to be, if it were in the parlance of today, as you might say, you had hoped to be an influencer.
I don't know how much I hoped to be an influencer, though I guess I was going to be in the media somehow. And I have not had a love-hate relationship with media by any means. It's been mostly very good. But I know from some people who get out there and take a position, they're going to pay for it in some way.
Especially today, I think.
Yes, including myself.
Mhm.
And there's an old line Art Buchwald had, if you can't take the heat, get out of the cabana.
Mhm.
So I guess I'm in the cabana.
So, and I don't know if this is still on the air, but is so you're never on Pawn Stars?
I was asked once,
Really?
and it didn't work out. But when you talk about a celebrity historian, we had the National Council for Public History conference in Las Vegas, And they asked me and two other people to be on a panel talking about being celebrity historians because we're often in documentaries and the like. And one of them was Mark Hall Patton, who is the
Yeah,
guy with the hat and the
with the
beard,
hat. Yeah.
yeah, who's often on Pawn Stars. And Mark told a story, and I can never match it. Two stories that can never be matched. One is that he was the curator of our county museum, which is a wonderful small museum, and people would come in constantly wanting to meet him. So finally, they did a cardboard cutout so that you could go in and get your picture taken with Mark, but Mark could keep working. He'd say, this is my day job. I can't leave this. But the other story he told was that he was traveling overseas. He was in Germany. He's getting gas for his rental car. And the owner of the service station came out, pointed at him, and said, Pawn Stars. Well, I was in a documentary about Las Vegas, and a friend of ours was vacationing in the Virgin Islands, came back from her spa, lay down on the bed, plopped down, put her hand on the remote to put on the TV, and the first thing she heard was my voice.
Oh,
I'd
shock.
hate to be in that position. I'd hate to be in the position she was in at that moment. So
Oh.
if you're going to be a celebrity historian, though, I think it should be for the right reasons. I will note that Alan Guelzo got out of the 1776
Mhm,
stuff as fast as his legs could carry him.
mhm.
And he takes political positions, and all well and good. And I studied with someone who's well known for his politics, but also his history is clean. And I think that's the important thing. You're not juicing the history a certain way.
Mm.
So I hope I'm on the right side of that one.
You're not Bill O'Reilly.
Oh, good God.
No.
Sorry. I'm sorry for the comparison.
That's quite all right. He's killed so many people now,
Oh,
killing Lincoln, killing, uh,
That
and
sells.
we had neighbors we really liked who said, "Have you read Killing Lincoln? Isn't it a great book?" I said, well, I haven't gotten to it yet.
Hmm.
Trying to
Have
be
you gotten
nice.
yeah.
to the
I
vampires
still
yet?
haven't gotten to
How
Yeah,
about the
it's on the list.
vampires?
it. Well, I do remind my students that before he was president, Lincoln was killing vampires.
Hmm.
But I also like the Bob Newhart routine where Lincoln's talking with Madison Avenue. So, Abe, you got to wear the hat, Abe.
Oh, can't say we don't have fun on this.
Yeah, we don't take ourselves too seriously, I don't think.
No.
I always say Ralph Roski, when I was an undergraduate, did not preach it, but instilled in me the idea we take history seriously, but we shouldn't take historians seriously.
No. No, we definitely should not. Uh, Makes life so much more fun.
Yes.
Any final words, Andrew?
I,
No. He's
I told you. I mean, I only had that one last question. I stuck to it.
uh, sounds like a plan. Well, then, for me, it is to say that A, thank you, Michael, for taking time this morning before your COVID shot, COVID booster shot,
Booster
and out
shot.
of your busy local history celebrity world to talk with
And,
us today.
Oh,
and sharing the department. We can't forget that one.
and
Yep.
Thank you. It's been a lot
just
of fun.
if you're still allowed to get your COVID shot in 2 hours.
This is true.
Yes,
Things could
that
change.
is very true. Things can change rapidly in that
Very,
regard. Of
very.
And we should also, just so that Fordham might get an order or two in, say that this was your Freedom, Union, and Power, Lincoln and his party in the Civil War, which looks like it's still on sale at Fordham University Press's website.
Or we can go to the trunk of my car. Well, the hatch. I have a hatchback.